partecipanti a questa tavola rotonda, che sono Luca Pisentini, segretario confederale della CES, Franco Mattini, segretario generale della FreeCams CGL, James Ricci, coordinatore settori catering, latticini e cani IUF Vita, Ayub Almendar, che è il presidente, no scusate, perché qui c'è Dennis che sostituisce Ayub, c'è Dennis che è già intervenuto ieri e che comunque rappresenta il sindacato, il gruppo COP-IS. Poi abbiamo Paf Akhtar di Uniglobal Union, Europa, direttore Marketing Managers, e Fernando Medina, responsabile politiche internazionali, FECOT, Commissione Sobreras. Allora, questa tavola rotonda rispetto al programma precedente dovrebbe adesso fare ancora un passo in avanti per quanto riguarda le strategie sindacali a livello transnazionale, e quindi sottolineo la parola transnazionale perché non parliamo più solo del livello europeo ma del livello anche globale.
So far we confined ourselves to the European level and to the role of European WCs and European federations. At this juncture we include in the discussion also the global union federations. And we can also make a step forward in terms of trade union strategy, because if so far we have focused a lot on the role of European works councils that play a role of information and consultation as defined by the European directive, now we have a step forward with reference to the bargaining at the transnational level, because one of the main limitations that is underlined very often with reference to the activity of European Works Councils is what they formally are not, is that they are not entitled to take part in bargaining at the European level. We are faced with a process that in the last, let's say, 15 years, but also with a greater role after the year 2000 of transnational negotiating process, bargaining processes, and signing of agreements at the international level, as they were initially called, and then there was a differentiation with reference to these transnational agreements, because there are more or less two directions. On the one hand, we have framework agreements, international framework agreements that are also called global agreements, that are signed by global federations. And on the other hand, at the transnational level, we have European agreements that are signed by European federations. And here there is another interesting aspect, namely that also the European Commission in the last few years dedicated great attention to this topic, and now there is a monitoring of this transnational bargaining activity. There's a database that is managed by the European Commission, and I don't know exactly the number, but I think that it's about 230 agreements, so to speak, transnational agreements, so to speak, that were entered in this database. But here, I think that we should be cautious, we should be careful, because we should say that the European Commission enters any type of agreement in the database, so it doesn't make a distinction with reference to the signatories. So we find agreements or joint declarations, even those that have been signed only by the European Works Councils and where there's no signature of the European Federation. And then there are the true European agreements that were signed also by the European federations. As you see, here too there's an aspect that emerges in the discussion of this topic concerning precisely who the players are and who is entitled to sign these transnational agreements. So, if the European Commission now has about 230 agreements or declarations at the transnational level, the trade unions have different figures, because both global federations and European federations recognize only the agreements that were signed by them. So, implementing this criterion, the number of transnational agreements would greatly decrease. So, this is the situation. Then, I would like to highlight another important difference with reference to the transnational bargaining activity. If the European Works Council is represented by the European Directive, it's a legal basis for any bargaining at the transnational level, which means that all of these bargaining processes at the transnational level take place solely on a voluntary basis. So this entails the signing of these agreements within multinational groups where there is a consensus by the management to reach the signing of these transnational agreements. So, the starting point is much different. Here we are talking about a context where it takes a certain convergence on the part of the social partners to reach this, to achieve this transnational agreement result. I would like to start with my first question. I would like to have 2 rounds of table, 5 minutes each. The first question concerns the role of the actors in this. I already mentioned that there is also an ongoing discussion in terms of the distribution of tasks within these processes. So I would ask my interlocutors, my counterparts, also taking into consideration the difference between the global and the European levels, what are the actors and what their contributions might be to reach the signing of transnational agreements. I would like to start with James Ritchie, coordinator for IOF UITA.
Thank you, and good morning. As you can probably tell from my accent, I am not from Europe. I work for the IUF. I've been with the IUF for some 8 months. I come from New Zealand, where I was the General Secretary of the New Zealand Dairy Workers Union. And I thought that I would begin my contribution this morning by talking a little bit about the role of engagement generally by trade unionists with employers, and there is a stepped process from the local plant level to the national level, and what my role is here and the subject of the panel this morning, the global level. And just to give you a little bit of perspective about New Zealand. New Zealand was a country that had legislative support for collective bargaining and for the role of trade unions in society like a European country, until a neoliberal government in 1991 completely removed all of the legislative support for social dialogue, for trade unions' role in society, for national collective bargaining. And so in New Zealand now there is no national collective bargaining. There is slightly better legislation than we had in 1991, but there is very little institutional support for trade unions to operate. And so New Zealand is something like a right-to-work state in the United States. And in a matter of 10 years, in 1 decade, union density in New Zealand fell from over 50% of the workforce to under 20% of the workforce. And it has since climbed up again to around 23%. So without institutional support, without legislative support, and without the role of the European Parliament, without the role of the European Commission, without the institutional support of all the member countries, it becomes very important to focus on what the engagement with an employer is about. Now, the European Works Councils are important institutions. Social dialogue is an important way of working, and Europe is very fortunate to have this legislative support. But in this age of austerity, following the crisis, in this age of austerity, what we are discussing with employers is of vital importance. The fact that we are in a process of social dialogue, or Europe is in a process of social dialogue between unions and employers, per se will not convince the millions of unemployed young people in Europe now. So how does our discussions with transnational corporations, how do individual unions implement their discussions as part of a strategy around their collective bargaining? Is the framework in which we are talking to to transnational corporations a framework which promotes and protects trade union rights so that workers can have the space to collectively organise and bargain to make sure that they protect decent work, protect wages and conditions, and give the space for those millions of people who do not have decent jobs or any job at all to be part of the social fabric of Europe, and indeed the social fabric of communities around the world. So our engagement with transnational corporations and with employers generally has to be part of a strategic framework. It has to be part of a strategic framework that is focused very strongly on the wages and conditions and the living standards of the members who pay our wages. And our engagement with employers is critically important, but it is not as important as our engagement with our members, because it is our engagement with our members that gives us the mandate to go and advocate on behalf of our members with employers to try and win the terms and conditions of employment and the space to organise that is so vital for living standards for the people of Europe and, of course, all around the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. And io passerei adesso subito.
I would now give the floor immediately to Pav Akhtar.
Thanks. Buongiorno, I think that's right. My name is Pav Akhtar. I'm with Uni Global Union, based in Nyon in Switzerland, but I live in France, though I am originally from Britain. So I'm very much a European worker. I work primarily with professionals and managers, but I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about the work of Uni at a global level, but also at a European level, because I think it's important that what James has said, I think I agree with almost entirely. It's really important stuff. What I would add to this discussion is what global unions, either at a global level or indeed at a regional level, can do, and how we support the work of our affiliates at a national level, at national and local level. The first thing I will say is that within Uni we have a organising strategy called Breaking Through. In 2010, we identified very clearly that we needed to build power among the workers because this power was being diminished. Our influence with our employers was being diminished and being eroded, and the consequences of that were that labour laws were being undermined. We found that precarious work was increasing. We found that wages were being decreased. And this coincided with some evidence that between 1980 and 2010, in 17 out of 24 OECD countries, the effective coverage of agreements, of collective bargaining agreements, had been reduced. So in 17 out of 24 countries, collective bargaining had declined and had decreased. This is clearly a crisis for the trade union movement, and the response to that is one that we need to try and understand and try and respond to. We found that the role of government was important. In many instances, governments were weakening labour law legislation. We found that employers were disregarding the role of the trade unions. They did not see the power of the unions or the value of unions. In essence, when you have a globalized labour, about 11% of the global workforce is within the trade union movement, it is easy to understand why the employers would ignore the role of the trade unions. And this has had really quite serious impacts on the trade union movement at a global level, but also regional and national level. And at Uni, we see our role and our potential role about supporting, organising and the building of power within our affiliates. I think that's the critical starting point. We need to organise in order to get secure jobs with justice. That's the absolute starting point. What we found in our experience of working on multinational agreements or transnational agreements, and we've worked on around, we've achieved about 50, just 49 I think it is, and we're working on our 50th at the moment. What we found is that the things that we need to do are about bringing our affiliates together, providing them with sharing of information about what activities are going on, what practices are working, what is not working. We need to try and use our global agreements as a way to reduce the fear that often exists in workplaces that prevents workers from being able to organize. And practically what we've also found is that global time is so short. If we're going to build effective strategies, I think three things really need to be understood. One is that global agreements aren't simply a case of goodwill of the employer or indeed a strong relationship with the home unions. We need more than persuasion to sign a deal in terms of a transnational agreement. We need pressure from different sources. It cannot just be from the workplace. We also have to link in with civil society, with groups outside of the workplace. We find that when organizing campaigns are small or isolated, they're often inadequate to inspire workers. If you don't have a strategy that is designed to win a collective agreement or some kind of success, then your strategy is unlikely to succeed or improve the lives of those workers. We found that campaigns need to be properly resourced and planned. In too many instances, unions are trying to run campaigns or activities without even an organizer. So if you have a requirement from your employer that you need to have 50% plus one membership in order to get union recognition, and you don't have an organizer to help you get to 50% plus one, in our experience, your campaign is unlikely to succeed or have a less chance of succeeding. We also think that changes at the national level often produce the opening or motivation for workers to organize in larger numbers. So you need drivers. The unions have to be flexible enough to respond to the opportunities when they arise. And I'll just wrap up with one very concrete example. In the last 15 days, UNI with other sister unions and industrial and civil society in Bangladesh, etc., worked on developing a fire and health and safety accord for the garment worker factories in Bangladesh. It happened within the space of 15 days. And the reason for this was that the unions did not go through committees and committees and committees. We recognized there was a problem. We identified that there needed to be a concrete solution, and there is a concrete window of opportunity. And we dropped all other activities and we focused on getting this health and safety accord. And okay, Walmart did not sign. That's okay. But many other multinational companies did. And so now you have the foundation for building a much stronger national initiative for other aspects or other sections of the workforce in that one country. And that model, we think, works in a multinational context.
Okay, thank you very much, Pav. A questo punto...
At this point, I would leave the floor to Deniz Aktugan from the Turkish Union. So what is your standpoint from a national perspective? In the meantime, I would go to the European level, where we have, from the standpoint of industrial relations, we have a more structured context. So I would ask, what are your observations, Luca, with respect to the players in this process, in this bargaining process at the European level? Thank you, Volker. Good morning, and thank you to Philcoms for organizing this very interesting initiative that's gathering so many players at a global level. I'll speak about transnational agreements from a European standpoint. I don't envy the colleagues who must manage these agreements from a global perspective. We already have our difficulty in managing them at a European level. I can imagine that at a global level it'll be even more complicated. However, these agreements are the only ones that we have to try to face the issues of globalization and to try to stop, if possible, initiatives coming from multinationals, which often aim at diminishing the levels of the conditions of the workers in these multinationals and in general in the work market at a global level. So these agreements are both a great opportunity but also pose great difficulties. The union movement in Europe started dealing with these agreements very late. As we also said this morning during the first part of the discussion, the only true element for discussion that we had for a long time was the presence of the EWCs within multinationals in Europe. There were no true agreements. Over the last few years, some specific agreements started to be implemented, but upon doing so, the union organizations substantially encountered two difficulties. The first one, with respect to procedures, to start bargaining negotiations to establish conditions, assess these agreements and their applicability. There are very many difficulties because there is no legislation at a European level. We have national legislation in contradiction, and we often have serious issues, as Volker was saying. With respect to the mandate of the players, there's this conflict in Europe among union organizations and the EWCs. The EWCs have had and continue playing fundamental roles in their communication with workers, in gathering requests and the possibility of diffusing information with respect to agreements and their implementation in the relationship with the workers. But the EWCs don't have a negotiation role, whether from a legal standpoint or political one, because they're not named by the workers to carry out a negotiation role. Their role has to be placed in the hands of the union organizations. The European trade organizations or federations must manage to obtain a specific mandate from their affiliates in each specific country. This is an important obstacle that we have at this point in Europe. Some European federations have set some very effective procedures. The first one, in terms of time, on which it was based, but also in terms of effectiveness, but also many other category associations have adopted very similar procedures. These procedures partially resolve these issues that we're discussing. On the one hand, they attempt to give a response to these problems regarding how a negotiation can be initiated or how you can present it at a European level or how you get into contact with the company to initiate this negotiation, how the EWCs are established at this level, and how agreements are written up to prevent an ambiguity in the text of these agreements, to prevent some actual application difficulties and binding conditions. At the same time, European confederations also tried to resolve the issue of the relationship with the EWCs. This relationship was theoretically resolved very well, but there are often still difficulties because there is a problem in the representation. To this date, we still do not have an actual union representation with its own legitimacy, because EWCs on the one hand must only handle legitimation and consultation, but only in contact with workers, and not all countries have a union reference points in the companies or representation. And sometimes these representatives are in conflict with the EWCs or with the unions outside of these federations. So we have a serious issue to resolve. And the other way to resolve this problem is to face the problem of representation at a European level, within European federations and in relation with national federations and with the representatives in the individual and single enterprises, meaning that we need national federations to give power to the European ones, but at the same time they must be able to constitute some true representations within the companies and on the places of work. The transnational agreements can be like a generic key, because they can also implement the social relations, especially where these are weak in those countries where they're working. If we can resolve this problem, we can probably also give a greater strength to the agreements. But this is the last thing I want to say in this first part of our discussion. We will not manage anyhow to totally resolve the legal value of these European relationships, because there are some issues that, from a legal standpoint, that are still pending, and we'll discuss them later. They may find a solution in Europe only if you manage to set up a framework at a European level that will actually allow us to make these agreements applicable in the different countries and companies. Thank you, Luca. I will now ask Denise for her presentation from a national standpoint.
To present my presentation, if it works. First of all, I would like to show you the general situation, Turkish labor life, and then I will say something about the alliances. In Turkey, organizing rate is very low, unfortunately. I will show you one statistic here. Yes, the union density and collective bargaining coverage rate in Turkey, you see on the slide is 12 or 13, but according to the latest official statistics, the union organizing rate, union membership rate is just 9%. And if we speak about the collective agreement workers, that is just 6%. And in the private sector, it is just 3%. And in our sector, commercial sector, it is just 1%. So we can go down and down. And why we need alliances? Because of this, because organizing rate is low in Turkey. And second thing I want to say is organizing difficulties in Turkey. First of all, employers use various tactics to discourage unionization, including intimidation, harassment, and dismissals of union members, which often go unpunished. In different sectors, different workers fired because of union membership in Turkey. And according to the Turkish Confederation statistics, every year 10,000 workers lose their job because of membership of union. So because of this, organizing is difficult. Because of this, we need alliances. And third one is the legal procedure. The collective bargaining procedure is very difficult in Turkey. We have thresholds. First, on the sector level, we have to get 3%. Okay. In our commercial sector, there is 2.5 million workers, and we have to get 3%, 75,000 members. Then we will organize in a workplace. We have to get 50% plus one, or if there is more than one workplace, that is 40% plus one. After that, we will apply the labor minister. Because of this, we need alliances. And employers use anti-union tactics. They are union busters. in many countries, in Turkey also. Because of this, we need alliances, and we cannot contact workers in the workplaces for organizing. The alliances help us to reach workers. And in Turkey, in the recent years, in some multinational companies, unions started to use the global agreements, global framework agreements to organize. For example, now UniGlobal is trying to make a global framework agreement with IKEA. So in Turkey, in the DHL, Ermeni Gozengda, UPS, Carrefour, H&M, in some multinationals, trade unions trying to use the global framework agreements, and not only to sign a global framework agreement, but also employers have to use the agreements and respect worker rights in practice. Thank you.
Thank you, Denise. Passerei la parola di...
I would now give the floor directly to Franco from CGL. In this first telegram that allows us to enter into the discussion, I'd like to say this very quick 3 points, and then during the second telegram, we will complete this task. Yes, some very timid experiences. We have lived a few of them, starting from this last quote that was mentioned, IKEA, HP, Sodexo. These are companies in which we tried to bounce back the effects of a transnational agreement, to intervene, to act on the condition of the workers and the rights also in other countries. But let's be honest, because we're here and we have to speak the truth. We have to be honest, as Bruno was saying. In front of the multinational giant, well, we can basically just tickle a giant, little more than tickle him. Juliana was talking about speed previously. Our rhythm, our pace, our speed is so distant from the actual speed at which multinationals are facing the present challenges. Second consideration.
Mentre prendiamo consapevolezza di questo limite.
While we are aware of this limitation, the things that are besides ourselves, that are outside of this room, continue worsening. We are living a full recession, at least in Europe. The crisis is quite dramatic, tragic. The context is unfavorable. Among the manifestations of this crisis, we see a folding back into national reasonings. So while we're here to talk about how we can be more transnational, the crisis is pushing us back, is setting us back to a vision of national defense. The crisis produces a second effect, since we're talking about agreements in Italy, but I think also in the rest of Europe. It is increasingly difficult to enter into agreements, but especially it is increasingly difficult to have these observed, because it is not sufficient to enter into agreements. They must also be respected and observed. Otherwise, they will be useless. So what situation are we experiencing? I will describe it with a figurative example. It's like the jumper who must jump, and he has 3 attempts to succeed to make this jump. In the first attempt, he will fail. The second attempt, he will probably fail as well. And then during the third attempt, the last attempt, is difficult. From 2 meters, the pole will be taken to 2.10 meters. So during the last attempt, we are asked to do more than what we're usually asked for. So third conclusion of the first telegram. Here too, let's be honest, since we're talking about players, actors. Player number one is the union, no doubt. We must modify the agenda of the international central unions, because the agenda of the international union headquarters, whether we're talking about the European Federation or the international or national, is not in line with what is occurring outside. We don't want to just represent a group of passionate people here, because otherwise this room will just be like in a UFO, where we're all are together, rotating around the universe without ever landing. We have to come out of this reasoning of people passionate about international policies. What collective bargaining aspects are being specifically discussed within the union? What project for representation and also assignment of entitlement? Because who makes the laws? Either the parliament, that is institutions, but there are also laws that are defined by the market. And at this time, the lies that are produced abundantly are the ones created by the market, not the ones created by political and democratic institutions. And I feel the need to recover our protagonism in these contexts between the union and the political institutions, whether European or non-European, because this is the essential limitation. In the case of Europe, the European crisis is not yet accompanying or leading the European government to re-question the policy of austerity instead of growth and development. But what are we negotiating with the policy, with the politics? This is what I meant to say. End of telegram. Thank you, Franco.
E concludiamo.
And we conclude the first round with Fernando, please.
Se nos pregunta por
We're being asked who are and what are the roles of the players who intervene in these union alliances and in the global agreements. I think that the answer is quite simple. The player, the main character, whether at a European or international level, can only be the international union federations in these contexts, and we cannot create a union alliance without the corresponding party, which is the actual union federation. However, it's not easy, and that requires going from a coordination, a unionization of coordination, because that is what happens still in Europe, to a unionization that proposes and acts. We have to change the agenda at the international level by using the expression of this moderator or this speaker who preceded me. Another comment: when we talk about EWCs, this is a project that, with all its difficulties, doesn't really represent unionization, because it happens at a European level. There's a series of norms, directives, and we move within that perspective. But when we speak of agreements, transnational agreements and union alliances, we speak of a voluntary topic that requires the initiative and the will of the union. Initiative and will that can only be addressed to obtaining a recognition on an international level, and to negotiate what was agreed among the members at an international level. And it can only be through an alliance. If there's no negotiation as objective, well, then it will be useless. Two observations Two final observations. This is not easy. I said before that we have to really set up a transnational discourse, and the transnational discourse is not a sum of all the national discourses. Just as at the national level the union covers different interests, the transnational discourse must also incorporate different interests, the interests of the different countries, and this is not easily achievable, but that is the challenge. Ultimately, when we are setting up these alliances and when we go on to talking about these international agreements at the company level, we need a series of tools, not necessarily in this order, but we need clear objectives. We want to negotiate an international agreement. We want to use the policies for social responsibility. What do we want to do? We need to set up a program to develop those objectives. We need to train the members of that alliance, both in the international organization and the national affiliates, a transversal training. We must incorporate that discourse at a national level, that transnational discourse that I mentioned before. The international aspects cannot be different, or in the best of the cases cannot be complementary to our bargaining. It must be something that is part of the same. With all these tools and all these implementations, we could move forward. Right now, I think this is sufficient.
Grazie, Fernando. Adesso
Thank you, Fernando. Now I would like to move on to the second round, which will be much shorter. So I would like to ask the panelists to be even more concise. We will have maximum 3 minutes available for each one. And my question for this second round is this one. What is the impact of these transnational agreements? Do they have a tangible impact at the corporate level? Because we also know that these transnational agreements are considered, especially by the management, as one element of their corporate social responsibility element, strategy, sorry. And so they're a little bit like public relations actions. So the question is, what is the tangible impact of these transnational agreements? And this time, too, I would like to start with James Ritchie. You have the floor.
Yes, thank you. I think quite simply put, international framework agreements or agreements with transnational corporations on a global basis have to be able to protect and promote trade union rights for people everywhere where the company operates, and they have to deliver more union members. They simply have to do both of those things. Because for many companies, having an international framework agreement or some other relationship with a global union federation means that they can tick the box of corporate social responsibility. So when NGOs come to do their social auditing, the company can say, yes, we've got a relationship with a global union federation, tick the box, move on. And for many transnational corporations, the international framework agreement is the end point. For us, it's the beginning. It's the beginning to be able to have a forum in which to resolve disputes about trade union rights. It's the beginning of being able to have workers access those rights and us being able to talk to the global headquarters of that company and say, we've got a problem here, the workers can't access their rights. And because our time is limited, I won't talk about too many examples, but recently, over the last 12 or 18 months, we have an international framework agreement with Sodexo, the global catering company, and that framework agreement not only states that workers have rights, but it sets up some processes where those workers can access their rights to join a union and bargain collectively. And of course, this has been a bit of a shock to the company to find out that we intend to organise and give those workers those rights within India, which is now Sodexo's second biggest market. There is no union organisation in India. The local managers have not heard about this framework agreement that is signed in Paris, but unless it delivers rights for workers to organise, bargain collectively and improve their wages and conditions, then the framework agreement is a complete waste of time as far as our global union federation, the IUF, is concerned. On the other hand, if it does facilitate access for workers to bargain collectively, exercise their trade union rights, then it is a very important tool indeed. And just to finalise, it is a tool towards an end. It is not an end in itself as far as a global union federation is concerned. Thank you.
Grazie James.
Thank you, James. Now the question goes to Pavakhtar. What is the tangible impact of these agreements?
Of these agreements can be considerable. The first thing to note is that when we sign global agreements, the primary objective of a global agreement is to create a safe space in order for unions to start organising workers. That has to be the critical factor. Create a space where unions are allowed to organise workers without fear of persecution or recrimination. Because that is too often absent in many countries and in many workplaces, despite sometimes good legislation in countries. The second thing I'd probably say is that we're finding it increasingly difficult, even in the European context, to sign multinational agreements with companies. And one of the reasons for that, and this happened very recently with the commerce sector, the garment workers issue, companies were worried that if they signed an agreement, they would be held legally responsible. Well, yes, that is ultimately a purpose, to hold companies responsible for activities that they, if they are not safeguarding the rights of freedom of association, that they should be held accountable for this. But this is also preventing a number of multinational companies or transnational companies from entering into agreements, formal agreements, and they would rather have an understanding than a written agreement. So this is a culture that we have to challenge. We have to persuade these multinationals that there is value in joining signing up to a global agreement. But we have to use the power within the trade union movement in order to demonstrate that we have the weight of the workers behind us, that we are intent on using these global agreements to help reduce the risk that a company faces. Now, for example, with the Bangladesh story, that we've used a lot of our European organisations, European unions and national unions within the European context were lobbying these companies, these multinationals in the national context, saying that your brand is being damaged in our country, in Europe, for example, because you simply aren't protecting the rights of workers in other countries. And if you have a global agreement that protects the right of all workers, then you can use that in a global context. I'll stop there, and I will just say this, that sometimes the global agreements have to be renegotiated, and we've done that recently with Securitas and Carrefour, because sometimes when those global agreements are not proving to be effective, we have to have the courage to say that this is not working. We have to have the courage to say that this needs to be reviewed, and we need to rewrite this agreement, and that's what we've done with Securitas and Carrefour recently.
Ok, grazie mille. Quindi io a questo punto.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask Denise, you already mentioned in your first intervention that they are trying to implement global agreements, so I would like to ask him, have they had any impact in your context?
In some companies who have global framework agreements, helped the collective agreement, helped organizing give contribution with relations between union and the company. And I can give some examples for Turkey. The Real Alliance, the Carrefour Alliance help the union to organize other national domestic companies. So this kind of contribution. But in some companies, global framework agreements do not exist. The local management don't recognize it, don't respect it. I can also give some examples. H&M has a global agreement with Uni, but we can't organize. They don't respect union, and in Turkey, I mean. And the Securitas, as mentioned before, they have also global framework agreement. In the Securitas job interview questionnaire, when a worker applied to job in Securitas, in the form, there is one question: do you member of any union? So this is another example. At DHL campaign, there is UNI and the ITF joint campaign now, and I think the global framework agreement will help this situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Denise. Quindi erano osservazioni anche piuttosto critiche e quindi
Those were rather critical remarks. I would like to ask Luca what the situation is at the European level. Well, first of all, Franco Martini was rightly saying that often we just tickle the multinational company. We don't have much power, but there are different situations. We had a seminar in Poland a few weeks ago, and our Polish colleagues brought us the two cases. For example, Volkswagen, where after great difficulties, a Polish trade union was able to have Volkswagen implement the same criteria in terms of working conditions and wages that are applied in Germany. And on the other hand, we have the example of telecommunications sector companies that were, despite the existence of global or European agreements, these agreements are not respected by the local management. This depends also on the strength of a trade union, not only by the goodwill of the enterprises. And this strength by the trade union varies from country to country and also within the same country according to the sector. The two things that we have to do, at least at the European level, to try and solve this problem and to fully exploit the potential of these transnational agreements in order to do something more than tickle the multinational company, on the one hand, is to strengthen our collective bargaining ability and applicability of agreements. The only way to do that is for national federation to try as much as possible to strengthen their representation within multinational companies, and on the other hand, they also have to give a clear mandate to the European and international federations, because without this mandate, the European and international federations have no chance to influence these processes. This nationalism that is coming out due to the crisis, unfortunately, exists also within the trade union movement, because very often we are so busy with our own domestic problem and we don't have the will to shift the attention towards the international level. Another element is that, at least at the European level, we need a legal framework in order to give a legal foundation to the agreements and to make them really applicable to all countries. We are developing on the mandate of European Federation. We are negotiating with the European Commission to reach this legal framework. You should know that the entrepreneurs' organizations do not want to hear about it. The only chance that we have to achieve this result is to act on the European Parliament on the one hand, but also on national governments and on multinational enterprises and on sectors organization of entrepreneurs. If we talk to Business Europe, we will have no chance to achieve this result. So this means, and I conclude, that your role as national federations of the sector is essential, because you are able to influence the position of sectoral entrepreneurial organization, but also the stance of the respective governments within the discussion at the European level, because the Commission, together with the trade unions at the European level alone, will not be able to solve this problem. From the grassroots, from the companies, from the countries, from national trade unions, there should be a thrust to achieve real change in this sector. Thank you. Thank you, Luca. And I now give the floor immediately. I would like to add two considerations to what Luca said. I completely agree with what he said. First of all, a further ingredient, the value of this dimension of global bargaining, transnational agreement, has to become a mindset of our organization. We need contamination, knowledge. We need to have a contagion about the awareness of this. First of all, this is a great cultural, trade union culture operation that has to move forward. That is why projects such as this one and a project of a more overall trade union training program is important. Number two, testing. How many did the Commission count in terms of agreement? 230, whatever the number is. Luca was talking about some positive experiences. We should identify 2, 3, 4 cases, further cases, and we should start testing these cases from the beginning, how the agreement is built, how it's managed, how it's implemented, how it lives in the various countries, so that then we can reason on the results of testing, and under the heading that the multinational for us is an enterprise based on trade union freedom, founded on the right of every worker to be acknowledged and be represented by a trade union. The first article of any agreement that we should sign is this one. Thank you. So we conclude with Fernando with his observation from the Spanish trade union viewpoint. Thank you. The question was on the value and impact of these agreements. The value is great, the impact is limited, at least for the time being. I believe that this is due to a main reason. Though the existing agreements are born with an offensive vocation, namely they are the fruit of the initiative and the proposal of the trade union movement, in general, they want to replace weaknesses at the national level, when a transnational agreement should be the fruit of the national trade union strength in a series of countries. So the impact is limited. However, we must acknowledge that in tangible situations, for example, where there are clear objectives, those where the necessary means are implemented, and with certain circumstances, for example, the agreement on the Bangladesh case, yes, there are results and there are positive examples. So in Algeria, for example, the Carrefour trade union in Colombia, after Unicomercio work in Latin America at the local level. Of course, Carrefour has subsidiary companies in Spain as well, but everything is useful. I would like to conclude by saying that I mentioned a whole series of tools and means to achieve these alliances and to develop these agreements. If they are developed in a proactive way, they can produce results. If we approach them mechanically and bureaucratically, within the national level and international level, this is has an impact. It will continue to have a limited impact. Thank
Grazie.
Well, thank you very much. I would like to thank all the speakers for being so disciplined in sticking with the time at their disposal, so we were able to conclude this panel.